now moving to our discussion. We're going to have a 15-minute discussion session. There's our questions. They're the same questions that we posed for our first session. This time we ask you to cast your minds to the presentations you've seen. And you are obviously, if there's things you think you want to discuss around navigating change that you haven't seen any presentations on, of course, they're open for discussion as well. So 15 minutes, I'll give you a time call, same process as last time. So pick one person, and they're going to come up and give us top points for each of the questions. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. You're holding up really well. I know it's afternoon nap time, I'm feeling it as well. But we've got this little report back, and then we've got afternoon tea, so you can lie on the grass for a little while, and then we have our panel discussion and we're done. So if I could just have your attention back to the centre of the room. If you've picked your person, who's going to come up and just give your 2 minutes feedback on your main points. Who wants to start? Who was the table that solved all the problems? You guys, you told me you'd solved everything, so you guys go first.
So lots of pressure to solve the world problems now, I guess. But so for the first question, what did you get out of these presentations? Basically that there are lots of different factors coming into play, from community investment to all the way to the very top of management, top level management basically, like the REEF 2050 plan. And those different mechanisms come into play, and they really need to work together to actually make change. For the second one, we talked about what challenges or questions that you think remain. Or the challenges mostly, we talked about trust, communication, and respect this morning, and that really takes a lot of time and effort. So I think that continues through this next session, that it's really difficult to get that trust, and like I mentioned, it takes a lot of time. And also individual power and translating that into our collective power. And then politics can be a barrier and a driver for most of this change that needs to happen. And then for the last one is within the broad theme, what do you think we need to prioritize? So again, equity within the community, taking the time to pilot and trial on-the-ground work to make sure it works, and accepting and acknowledging that politics is part of the process. And that's all we got.
Okay, so we started just having a conversation about did we define change in the session and did we navigate it? So we kind of redid first question. Similar to what we've just heard, we talked about how change is often quite gradual. There's change around things like climate change to science, change to practice, suggestions of change to governance. But how do we frame all that change? And most change we felt came from reaction and not being progressive. So actually, bleaching happens, there's a reaction, we get REEF 2050, so on and so forth. So when we were looking at the different, is that right? Michelle was on our team as well. So. And so then we thought about things like, well, if you're just constantly having a reaction, part of that is, as just noted, because of the political system, we change parties we don't change parties, we have elections every 3 years. So there's a need to do, you can never take the politics out of the REEF, I think it's got too political, but there is a need to get bipartisan support and everyone kind of being on the same page, because otherwise it will change because of the election cycle. And at the moment it's too politically divided. So really it's about trying, in the first section we looked at how do you move from reacting to change to actually driving that change and having a long-term strategy around coping and sort of dealing with that. And then the challenges remained. We're tag teaming this, so you're next, Bob.
And the challenges, well, basically getting realistic on coordination and collaboration. We talk about it a lot, but it's too many silos still out there between industries, universities, and a lot of the government agencies as well. So it really is something about, you know, getting out there. Also, I think the challenges, sometimes it's not so much the policies that are in place, but it's finding that one person in that organisation that's got the goodwill to actually make a difference and give you more information and actually help you with that. So it is something there. And also, I think the business of don't be afraid to be a champion, really it's a case that sometimes you get individuals in an organisation that do make that change. So we really try and encourage people to take on board that role and step up, basically, and don't worry about your policy or whoever's in place, because I think it's a general message that's getting out there to everybody that we have to have a different way of doing business and a change. And I think for everybody right now, it is a new way of doing business and we have to learn.
And we're out of time.
I'll just stand up taller. So I think we came out of that first section that in navigating change, we were seeing a lot of knowledge translated into practice as well. And that, in the end, is our biggest priority as well. But what we decided, we talked about, was how do we galvanise action? So there's opportunities there, like rethinking the endangered listing, or the way that Bruce talked about the R app, and in terms of bringing social behaviour into risky situations and political decision-making. So if we're looking at how we could reinforce that, and you think about what Angie's presentation and Yolanda's earlier, which was all about communication into practice and making decisions that are hard. And it is hard, because change is hard, risky, and it's political. And everyone works with the assumptions government can just fix things, and government can't. Because we have to take on the opportunities and the challenges, which is it's complex. We seem to be doing it for a long time, and we don't feel like we necessarily have made progress, but we are making progress. So there has to be a little bit of hope. So how do you encourage bringing the hope into the system? But we're talking about systematic and institutional change. So they're the challenges, and I think I'll go back to what I said at the front end, is it's about taking our knowledge and working out how we can put it into practice as a system. Does that work, guys?
I'm upgraded, now I have someone that holds it at least. So our group, in our group we said, what did we got out of this presentation? So the theme that came out is that adaptive capacity was a key concept in navigating change in general in different presentations. And also being realistic. It's very important when we need to do, for example, in the restoration and adaptation presentation. What challenges? One challenge is something that's already been mentioned about the difference between political time frame and then the reality of the outcome. Sometimes you can achieve the outcome in only 3 years or 4 years of mandate. And the last one, what do we prioritize? So what we were thinking is that it's important to think that there's not one solution, there's multiple solutions, different plans, and the importance is that they need to link together. So this should be a priority to understand all different perspectives and plans and link them together. And then the silo effect, maybe someone, Yes, there's to be more communication between the researcher. Thank you.
Okay, so for the first one, what did we get out of the presentations? Change is hard. That was a big one. And that people have limited capacity for change often, and probably we overestimate that capacity sometimes as well. And it can be in a variety of ways that people may have that limited capacity too, but also that the actions can be derailed by, a single factor. You may have all the other factors right in the equation, but if you have one of those not quite there, you might not get the change that you were after. For number 2, what still remains, that we talked more about the common goal and needing to have that sort of thing to work towards, which there can be challenges with the way governance is set up and the structures that we have. And building on something someone said about the realistic expectations, we talked about how do you determine those realistic expectations and what do they look like. Number 3, what do we need to prioritise there? I think there's we thought there was some simplification that could occur for some of the ways that some of the plans that you might have, some of the governance that might exist, that there could be some simplification that would enable some easier communication of what we're about and where we're heading. And the importance of some of the personal communications, so sort of the words like humanise, not institutionalise, looking at a personal level, so not just communicating at a whole company or industry level, but the importance of those on-the-ground communications with people.
Me again. Oh dear. So, for number 1, we really liked the scope of the presentation. So from that real big picture, you hear about decisions being made about the GBR listing, but you don't understand the context in which it's occurring and those broader patterns that are happening at that level. So really enjoyed understanding that. But also then right down to quite a fine level, and particularly the mental bandwidth of farmers and the capacity of farmers to make change, and understanding that these are real people who have real lives and real challenges. They're not just one homogenous group with 100% capacity for change. There's a lot going on there, so understanding them and their challenges, very important. In terms of the challenges, one of the things that we haven't really discussed today is agro-politics. So we have discussed politics, but politics within agricultural business. And there's a lot of players in that space, and there's a lot of tension between them. So even within the same industry, 2 bodies won't necessarily agree and will play politics with each other. That goes right down to a community level as well. So even between farming properties, that kind of thing. And one of the things we really noted, and this is very predominant in the cane space particularly, is that it's very male-dominated industry, and it comes with this culture of conflict. You've got to fight, rather than look to collaborate, and it's always this sort of mentality of, conflict and, I've got to fight for my rights and that kind of thing. We also talked about strategies for extension officers and the challenges they face in sort of straddling 2 worlds, trying to make a project work and understand the strategies and the big picture and water quality while actually being on the ground and having relationships and having to make all of that work. So that's a real challenge for extension officers, is how to take, you know, the kind of things we discussed today, but actually live in that on-ground world and make all of that work with individuals. In terms of priorities, we love the term pracademic. That was a great one. And again, it is about taking these kinds of things and how do we actually bring that down to that on-ground level and an individual relationship with someone who has to make a practice change. And that's a real challenge. And coming from an NRM perspective, one of the challenges I have that people probably wouldn't realise is I can't get access to academic journals that aren't open access. So there's a whole lot of research out there I'd love to read. I don't have access to it. So that's one of our challenges. And also just the understanding the realities, the on-the-ground, day-to-day practical realities for people that are out there doing that face-to-face practice change. We have to face the reality that there are some people out there who are quite aggressively against what we're doing. We have had instances with people pulling guns. So, you know, it's very easy to talk about it in this kind of space, but understanding the actual realities of dealing with people on the ground in this space is also really important. So that was ours.
Hello. So at our table, what we got out of the presentations was that that the governance in the GBR is complex and change is complex, and we also quite enjoyed the different scales that were presented today. So right down from people's mental bandwidth right up to the World Heritage listing status, and particularly that mental bandwidth stuff gave a few of us at the table quite a bit of pause for thought about that human side of change and the cost and capacity. What challenges or questions remain? There was one that was posed about potentially in dealing with complexity, some groups amongst us who have form in this space is Indigenous traditional owners and knowledge holders, and there was a question posed there about what work is being done on traditional knowledge frameworks and the capacity to adapt and apply to some third way of managing complexity on the reef, and that led to lots of discussion at our table about how that might be advanced. And we know there's pockets of work and increasing pockets, growing pockets of work in that space, but we didn't know a lot about that at our table. So wanting to hear more about that. And I don't think we really answered the third question, except for maybe prioritising that, the integration of frameworks of knowledge that are good at dealing with complexity going forward.
Mine was the first, wasn't it? It was indeed. We don't really have that much minutiae. I mean, this has been mentioned by everybody really, but our first point was one of just the, constantly sort of humbled by the sheer complexity of the situation we face on the Great Barrier Reef and the number of different players and stakeholders involved, and that really came through from the different presentations from management to the smaller scale. And in terms of challenges,
I guess listening to a couple of people, someone said change is hard. Yeah, change is hard. And also that concept of mental bandwidth. I think certainly what we see in the media of late is this media discourse of technological fixes, create a nice warm blanket for us. Life's really hard, change is really hard, but if we can focus just on someone's got this, because I buy a simple technological fix out on the reef, then I think we're very comforted by that, and I think we need to probably guard ourselves against that. I know as good scientists and social scientists, we, I guess, take that quite expansive view, but I think it's going to be hard to engage media in some of those really hard, complex issues. And I think that sort of relates to our other point here on question 2, is how does social scientists, do we synthesize all of our different methods and all of our different findings into coherent stories for policy in particular? Question 3 about priorities, we didn't get that far again, but I really trust the rest of you for having come up with what those key priorities are. I suppose one of them is, I guess, a continuation of this forum, hopefully in years to come. So that's a priority.
Hi everyone. So the things that we spoke about were some of the key points of change, being sort of in the reef space involving high risk, high uncertainty and high consequences. So in terms of number 2, what challenges or questions, we just spoke about, when the next event happens, like whether it's another mass bleaching or cyclone, what's going to happen with the current things that we have in place, and spoke about like strategic versus reactive in a space of accelerated change, and obviously in the political space as well. Priorities, capacity building, and we also said events like these, for knowledge sharing and breaking down silos, and people who have been involved in this space a lot longer said it used to, there were more silos in the past and it's getting better, but events like these are really good for continuing that. So did you guys have anything else to add, or we're all good? Cool. All right, thank you.